Okay, so good morning. I'm actually sitting at Brownlee Jewelers in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're going to go through fairly rapidly a series of slides that I'll be using in presentations all throughout this summer, speaking to the issue of trends, the way that trends are changing, the way that you have to run your jewelry store to be most successful, the way that your overall numbers as well as your future revenues will be driven by the way that you now react to your knowledge about what's going to be on trend. In order to establish some credibility, I'm going to show you one piece of evidence. What we're now looking at is a slide from the KPI report from the Edge Retail Academy. The Academy is a consultancy that takes all the data from over 850 jewelry stores and then puts it into a single server and spits out a 29-page report every month. It's actually quite valuable, and I would encourage you to look into how you might be able to get it. But the bottom line is, the first 25 pages will measure an individual store's performance against the group. And then the last 4 pages is kind of like a report card for vendors and vendor products. This is actually taken from the top 15 selling SKU report for the month of December this last year. Now, I know the numbers are really small, but I've done one thing to help make a point. You'll notice that in the vendor column, which is the far left, some of the vendors are red. In fact, all of the reds are actually Gems 1. So the point I'm making here is that of the top 15 selling SKUs last year, in over 850 stores, Gems 1 had 11 of the top 15. Now realize that's out of thousands of suppliers and literally tens of thousands of SKUs. And the reason I'm showing you this is clearly this is not happening at random. It's happening because we have successfully identified what's going to be hot. We have provided the advertising tools associated with it, and then we've shelf stocked it. Because let's face it, if you have one of an item and it gets hot, it won't necessarily get hot until December the 8th. You've got to be able to rely on us to be able to resupply it. So, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not showing this to brag, although obviously we're very happy with the results. And in candor, I'm a little annoyed about the 4 we didn't get. But hopefully this will provide credibility for the rest of the presentation. So the reason that we're so good at this is not that we're smarter than everybody else or we have a crystal ball. So what's interesting about the data is clearly our approach is different. And so what I'm going to now do is show you the way that we think about things differently than almost everybody else, which is we don't have a crystal ball. We can't look at a piece of jewelry and say that's obviously going to be hot. What we're using is math. I tend to think about things in terms of mathematical models. So let's explore for just a couple of minutes the mathematics of trends. This is the classic exponential curve. In fact, it's amazing how if you take lots of things in real life and you plot them, you end up with 4 or 5 graphs over and over again. This is y equals x squared. And if you make the y-axis sales and the x-axis time, this curve almost perfectly describes what it's like when a trend takes off. So in the Southeast in 1953 with hush puppies, or throughout the country in 1974 with mood rings, or in 1999 with 3-stone rings. The sales just started with a trickle and then they took off. We even used the expression, took off like it was shot out of a cannon. The reason this curve looks like it does is because of this curve. This is the consumer adoption curve. It's a fundamental idea within the world of marketing. A group of clinical psychologists did an in-depth study of American consumers trying to discover if there were certain predispositions that different people had to buy in different ways. It turns out we do. About 16% of us are either innovators or early adopters. And what that means is we have a tendency to want to buy a thing first in our social group. For us, the advantage of being first, that wonderful feeling that we were the first person on the block to have it, outweighs the potential disappointment that we might have in the product. On the other end, you'll see almost exactly the same portion, about 16% are laggards. For them, the reverse is true. For them, the potential for disappointment in the product outweighs the joy of being early. So they'll wait until all their friends have it to make sure that all their friends are happy before they'll then buy it. So if we put the two curves together, you can see why this happens. As the trend moves through innovators and early adopters and starts to get into the early majority, the increase in the number of consumers buying is exponential. So this drives this almost every single time. Now, trends have always been important, but they're actually far more important today than ever before. Historically, if you take any normal jewelry environment, that store is going to do somewhere between 6 to 7% of its business monthly, but then it suddenly peaks to about 24% in December. If we take a look at the way that sales worked in the 80s and the 90s, you can see here typical sales month after month, 6 to 7%, a little bit of an uptick in November, and then a huge uptick in December. Stores selling essentially staple items. If we blow up the December figure, this is what was happening. And I've studied the data pretty closely, and it seems to happen over and over again. You've got the 6% threshold of business month after month, but then in December you would literally sell 3 times as much as you normally sold in any given month. So if you normally sold 1 pair of half-carat total weight diamond studs per month, in December you'd sell 3. So a normal store to hit the 24% of its total sales in December would sell 3 times as much of the staples, and then you'd also have your whales. You'd have the customer who came in once a year, generally in December, to buy that big ticket item. That's one of the reasons that you would typically want to get memo of high ticket items from your suppliers in December, because you couldn't reliably sell it all year long, but in December you had a much better chance of selling it. So now fast forward to today. Today your store is actually, sales consist of 2 categories, staples plus trends. So if we take a look and see the impact of the internet and social media accelerating the consumer acceptance and knowledge about trends, actually intensifying the impact of trends on overall jewelry sales, this is what the curve now looks like. You see, again, staples running along at 6% and then going up slightly, but trends in December would actually drive the big increase. So if we blow the December figure up, here's what we've seen the last 2 years. There's about a doubling in the sales of your staples. And then the rest of the business in December is actually being generated by trend items. Also notice what's not on this curve. There are no whales. What everybody is complaining to me about now is that they're not getting these big tickets in December. And different stores define whales in different ways. For some stores, it's a $50,000 an upsell. For others, it's a $10,000 up. But however you define whales, jewelers are telling me across the country they're not getting these sales anymore. Unfortunately, not being on trend has several key impacts. The first is there's no way for you to make your December figures if you don't have the trend items, because that's the way the consumer is now buying. Secondly, it means not having the right products to drive traffic. If you choose to advertise staples in December, once upon a time that was a good thing because staples took off, but now staples aren't taking off. And so you can't drive traffic unless you're advertising trends. And the third part that's really spooky is the possibility of becoming irrelevant in your community. Remember that if you're attracting the innovators and the early adopters, that then makes you relevant for the next 3 years in a trend that lasts 3 years, because when Mary's wearing that new thing, and everybody knows Mary is a trendsetter, she's got the right hairstyle, she's got the right dresses, she's the one who knows what's on trend. When she sees that piece of jewelry and when her friends see that piece of jewelry on her and they ask her, hey, where'd you get it? Well, I got it at Brownlee. Great. That's actually going to drive that business. Being on trend means 2 really important things. The first is capturing those innovators and early adopters. I call that the gift that keeps on giving, because once you've made that sale, that becomes a walking billboard in her social group for all of her friends to come in and buy. And secondly, it means establishing a dialogue with millennials. Who's the most trendy consumer in the marketplace? It's millennials, right? So, and millennials happen to be the group that are also buying engagement rings. So if we can use being on trend to establish the dialogue with the millennial to make an inexpensive purchase, that's the beginning of potentially getting the engagement ring sale. This is a pretty spooky graph. This is a graph from a buying group that I'm very familiar with, in which there are a large number of stores who report their sales each month in terms of how much they're either up or down from the same month for the prior year. Normally, anything that looks like this ought to look like a bell curve. Basically, anytime you plot a random population, what you'll see is there will be clustering in the middle. This ought to look like this. Most stores even, some of them up, some of them down. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is something that mathematicians call bifurcation. There are some stores that are doing extremely well, and there are some stores that are doing extremely poorly. And as I watch this, because I get a copy of this data every month, what I'm seeing is this bifurcation is occurring. Mathematically, the way that you take a population and you disturb it so it looks like this is if you have a non-random variable with a non-zero value. And for me, I think what's perturbing this is trends. If we look back to the consumer adoption curve, the stores, let me just flip back for a sec. The stores that are up here, 15, 20% up, they're up there because they're very, very good with innovators and early adopters, and they're getting the trend items right, and their bridal's growing. The stores that are down here, 15, 20% down, They're very bad with innovators and early adopters. And we're seeing this more and more. We're even seeing it to a point where we are starting to rethink our credit exposures with jewelry stores based on the extent to which they're on trend. Now, it's important to understand that trends have sources and drivers. I get phone calls all the time from jewelers saying, hey, some guy just came in with this line of elephant earrings, and he says that's going to be the hottest thing since sliced bread. Well, honestly, probably not so much. Unfortunately, most of the people who talk with you or trying to sell you something are going to tell you that something's really hot. I would encourage you, take a look at the source and take a look at the drivers. Now, many times doing this lecture and this seminar before, I've spent the next 15 or 20 minutes talking about sources and drivers. This time, let's just look at two basic equations. The first is what I describe as the law of demand wave height. And what this is the height or the size of the wave is determined by two things: the force that's contributed by the source and the force that's contributed by the driver. So let's say, for example, that the source of the trend is Tiffany's, and then the driver, the advertiser of the trend, the big advertiser, ends up being Sterling because they pick up on the same piece and they push on it. That guarantees you're going to have a massive trend. Similarly, let's say the source is some relatively small jewelry supplier, and 100 independent jewelers throughout the United States choose to pick up that item. Unfortunately, the F sub S and the F sub D there is going to be too small. The trend's not going to take off. The second equation is this, the law of trend wavelength. This has to do with how long the trend's going to last. Basically, the length of the trend is proportionate to the inverse square of its initial height. And what that means is sometimes things that really take off really fast also disappear really fast, right? What I love is when it takes a trend a while to build and it's really getting well established. That's the kind of trend that you know is going to be really important. And just remember, everything I've talked about so far is what drives our ability to consistently have. I should mention, by the way, last year we had 11 of the top 15, but for the last 7 years we've had somewhere between 9 and 13 of the top 15 sellers, year after year after year, because this way of thinking about it seems to be the right way of thinking about it. So with having said these things, here's what I think are going to be the top 10 trends for the upcoming fall season. Trend number one will be bezels in a huge, huge way. When I was in Hong Kong, I went to booth after booth after booth and saw bezels, bezels, bezels. And then at the JCK show, we saw them everywhere. Even Levion, their big banners were bezel set items. So long straight bezels, graduated bezels, individual bezels, any of these kinds of looks are going to be absolutely on fire this fall. And unlike normal years, trend number two is an extension of this. Trend number two will be diamonds by the yard. So let me actually handle both of these at the same time. So this clearly is a bezel phenomenon. Now, I can tell you that obviously you've had diamonds by the yard for years. You may have even been selling them. But the key to this is, in spring of 2016, Tiffany launched Diamonds by the Yard by Elsa Peretti. By fall, Kay's was starting to use Diamonds by the Yard in certain key pendants. And it became well known that the number one dollar producer in sterling was a Diamonds by the Yard pendant piece. And so since all the site holders get data like that and they react to that, now this spring we've seen Diamonds by the Yard everywhere. And I can also tell you that one of the huge advertisers this coming December is going to be focusing on a Diamonds by the Yard piece just like this. So I know this is coming. I think it's going to be a really big deal, and this is definitely a wave that you're going to want to get on top of. Trend number three is Tiffany hardware. Tiffany hardware is Tiffany's reaction to the unfortunate reality that millennial females may not desire a piece of jewelry from Tiffany. I think the problem Tiffany has is a branding problem. Millennial women don't want what their grandmothers had or what their mothers had. They want something new, and so the enormous brand equity that Tiffany has had with older generations is not applying to Tiffany right now. And you can see it in their sales and their stock price. Tiffany hardware is their response to this. I expect them to spend a tremendous amount of money positioning this new product. They're actually using Lady Gaga. There is no bigger celebrity on planet Earth than Lady Gaga. If you go to the Tiffany.com page, you will see the entire presentation. Basically, the product looks like this. You need to be aware there is an edgy, almost kinky element to this, because hardware is actually the euphemism for body-piercing jewelry. So in their tagline, Tiffany is actually calling this elegantly subversive. So what's cool is for the current generation of older folks, this looks like ball and chain pieces, but for the millennial female, this is pretty wild and edgy for Tiffany to do. So expect this to be a major deal as we get into December of this year. Trend number 4 is the shift from chunky, clunky sterling silver into dainty, delicate, petite pieces. This past year at the Vicenza show in Italy, all of a sudden the entire industry launched all these tiny little pieces. And so by the time I got to the Hong Kong show, it was everywhere. What we're talking about are small gold pieces, either individual silhouette items like the shapes that you see here, or individual bezel set diamonds. This is a fascinating thing. I think you're going to see that sterling silver is now going to be relegated primarily to $99 and down. And above that price point, it's now going to need to be gold. This also may accelerate the shift back to yellow, because the only way you can prove that what you're wearing is gold is if it's gold colored. Trend number 5 is mine to market. And you heard me say earlier that I love it when it takes a trend a while to come in, because the longer it takes for it to get to established, the longer it's going to last. This is an enormous deal. This is the new way of selling diamonds. I've just put a few of the logos here. You've got Helzberg's My Diamond Story, Zales Love Destiny, Jared's Chosen, the AGS Only My Diamond, and my favorite, of course, is the JIA Mind to Market program, because that's the one out of all of these that not only has a book for each diamond, it's also got an electrical, a digital component in the form of an app. This is really important, and it's over the course of the next 2 years, you're going to see a flooding of the market of this method, because it's pretty clear that somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of all consumers want to buy a diamond with these characteristics. Trend number 6 are diamond illusions. Last year at the Hong Kong show, I saw my first of these CAD tops, where they were actually making a top for a ring, putting facets in the white gold metal, and then dropping the diamonds in. The other version of this is to have a single stone that then has a 0.5 millimeter illusion plate underneath it. This actually comes from a memo test that Rosie Blue did with Zales now 5 years ago. And what they discovered is the consumer likes this. They don't want to see the metal. The metal needs to be so small that it just accentuates the size of the diamond. This year at the Hong Kong show, I saw at least 15 manufacturers doing this, and the reflection plates were everywhere. So expect this to also be terribly important. Trend number 7 is being driven by Kendra Scott. One thing I would say is if you don't have the Kendra Scott line, you should get it. You need to be aware of the fact that last year they did $165 million in very inexpensive jewelry. This is basically the look over and over and over again. This partly accentuates this move to dainty, because these pieces tend to be dainty and delicate, but you need to be aware this look is unbelievably hot, particularly with millennial females. Trend number 8 is two-stone. I've moved it to number 8 because, in candor, I don't know what its longevity is. Sterling has made a huge push, and they've created brand equity in their brand, and the entire industry is still going to be advertising this. I mean, the Fred Meyer Mother's Day flyer was all two-stone on the front with their brand. So, but I would expect the core styles to be the sellers. What we're seeing in the data is that the core look is what's selling, combined with the two-tone look. Those are the two best-selling SKUs within the category. That's what you need to make sure you've got when the majors start their advertising in November. Trend number 9 is celestial. There is a regular periodicity of 12 to 18 months from when a thing gets hot in the boutiques to when it migrates, if it does migrate, into regular jewelry stores. You're going to see all kinds of items that are celestial being advertised. They're already being worn, and they're being worn by celebrities. By December, this is going to be hot as can be. One thing to remember also, there will be a focus on August the 21st on the fact that there will be a pretty big deal solar eclipse that goes all the way from Oregon to Charleston, South Carolina. So there's going to be so much news on that, that's going to stimulate people thinking. But anything that has to do with stars or moons is going to be a big deal. I'm also showing you this piece. It happens to be celestial, but anything that's got this jibbity, lots of little things on a necklace like this, that's going to be very much on trend as we move into the fall season. And finally, number 10 is sliders. There is a designer in Europe who has launched this, Makessa, and it's everywhere in Europe. And I'm already aware of memo tests that are being done at the majors in the States of this kind of look. So expect this to also be on trend by the time we get to December. And then finally, there are 2 categories that I have been Speaking of as trend items for the last 4 or 5 years, the dancing diamond category, of which our brand is Rhythm of Love, as well as stackable everything, stackable necklaces, stackable bracelets, even the use of stackable rings, things that don't match, to be wedding bands for an engagement ring. So what I see happening now is I don't think we should talk of these as trends anymore. They've been firmly established. They're like diamond studs. They're going to stay in the jewelry retailing environment for a long time. So this is one of my favorite slides. I call this guy Surfer Dude. Surfer Dude is not working hard right now. Surfer Dude could actually be smoking a cigar and drinking a margarita on his board. Yes, it took some effort to get up and get going, but at this point, the wave is doing all the work. And the reason I'm showing you this slide is because we at Gems One, neither we nor you in a normal independent jewelry store have the funding capacity to create a consumption wave like this. These waves get created by the big guys doing tremendous amounts of advertising. What we do have the funding capacity for is to build a surfboard. If I know when the wave is coming and I know about how tall it's going to be, then I can design a surfboard in the form of the right products and the right advertising tools, and then talk Presentatioon into stocking it in sufficient quantity so that when you need it, we can resupply it. So this, to me, is the best picture of where you need to take your store this fall. You need to position yourself for these waves. You need to have your surfboard ready because the wave is coming and it's going to be a fun ride. So with that, have a great day, and I hope this has helped you as you build your marketing and merchandising strategies for fall 2017.